They heard it before they saw it, one German officer would later confess through trembling lips, a sound like the earth tearing itself apart. When the bombardment finally ceased, there was no forest left, no trenches, no recognizable ground, just craters filled with pieces of what used to be men. In 3 minutes, an entire battalion had ceased to exist. The date was January 12, 1945, and the Wehrmacht had just encountered something that would rewrite every assumption they held about warfare. The Soviets had not simply brought more guns to the Vistula-Oder front, they had brought annihilation itself, concentrated into salvos so dense that German veterans of Verdun and the Somme would weep at the memory. 50 times deadlier, the reports would claim, 50 times more lethal than anything they had prepared for. Why did the earth swallow an army in minutes? Why did officers who had survived 4 years of Eastern Front combat freeze in absolute terror at a sound? And how did one nation transform artillery from a weapon into an apocalypse? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The doctrine did not begin with hatred. It began with mathematics, with cold Soviet pragmatism born from being broken. In 1941, when the Wehrmacht had swept across Soviet territory like a scythe through wheat, the Red Army had learned a lesson written in the ashes of entire divisions. German combined arms doctrine, the marriage of armor, infantry, and tactical air support, had shattered every defense. Soviet commanders watched their men die in waves, watched their tanks burn, watched their artillery get picked apart by Stukas before they could even sight their targets. The humiliation was total, the cost was unthinkable. 20 million Soviet citizens would die before the war ended, and in those early years, it seemed the bleeding would never stop. But the Soviets did not collapse. They adapted, they learned. And what they learned was this: if the enemy excels at maneuver, at speed, at combining arms into surgical strikes, then you must create a weapon so overwhelming that maneuver becomes meaningless. You must turn the battlefield itself into a killing floor, where there is nowhere to maneuver to. This was the birth of Soviet deep battle doctrine, but more specifically, it was the birth of something the Germans would come to call the Red Storm. Artillery, the Soviets realized, was not a supporting arm, it was the arm. Everything else, the tanks, the infantry, the aircraft, existed only to exploit what artillery had already destroyed. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the man who would orchestrate the final Soviet offensives into Germany, understood this with religious clarity. He was not a man of poetry or grand speeches. He was a butcher in the most literal sense, a commander who measured success in enemy divisions annihilated, in kilometers of scorched earth reclaimed. His officers feared him more than they feared the Germans. One Soviet general recalled Zhukov's words during a planning session in late 1944 with the kind of chill that never left him: "We do not need to outthink them, we need to outkill them. Bring me enough guns, and I will erase their front line before they know we have attacked." The Germans, by contrast, had built their doctrine on elegance. Blitzkrieg was not about brute force, it was about the rapier, not the hammer. Concentrated armor punching through weak points, infantry exploiting gaps, air power isolating and destroying pockets of resistance. It was warfare as art, as chess, as a thing of beauty and precision. German officers prided themselves on tactical flexibility, on small unit initiative, on the ability to adapt faster than their opponents. For years, this had worked. It had conquered Poland in weeks, France in months, and had nearly broken the Soviet Union entirely. But by 1945, the elegance had curdled into desperation. The Wehrmacht was bleeding from 1,000 wounds. Manpower was collapsing, fuel was a memory, the Luftwaffe barely existed. And yet, German officers still clung to the belief that superior tactics could compensate for inferior resources. They believed that training, experience and fighting spirit could hold back the red tide. They were about to discover how completely wrong they were. The Soviets had not come to outmaneuver them. The Soviets had come to bury them. The contrast could not have been sharper. On one side, a German army that had once conquered a continent, now reduced to fighting with old men and children, clinging to doctrines written for a war they were no longer fighting. On the other, a Soviet military machine that had rebuilt itself into something monstrous, something that did not care about elegance or artistry. The Soviets had learned to wage war like a force of nature, implacable and indifferent to cost, and at the heart of this new way of killing was artillery. Not as it had existed before, but as something transformed, concentrated, and wielded with an intensity that defied comprehension. The preparations began in absolute secrecy. Throughout December 1944, Soviet rail lines hummed with traffic moving west, trainload after trainload of guns, shells, propellant, prime movers and ammunition arrived at staging areas behind the Vistula River. German intelligence noticed the increase in activity, but they failed to grasp the scale. Their reconnaissance flights were shot down. Their spies reported numbers that seemed exaggerated, impossible. Surely the Soviets could not be massing that many guns in one sector. Surely it was deception, maskirovka, the Russian art of military deception. It was not deception, it was prophecy. By early January 1945, the Soviets had concentrated more artillery in the Vistula bridgeheads than had been assembled for any single operation in human history. Over 32,000 guns, howitzers, mortars and rocket launchers were aimed at a frontage of less than 300 kilometers. This was not a bombardment, this was density of fire that transformed air into pressure, that turned earth into liquid. The Germans, dug into their defensive lines, had no idea what was coming. They knew the Soviets would attack, they always did, but they expected what they had seen before, heavy but manageable fire, followed by waves of infantry and tanks that German machine guns and anti-tank weapons could blunt. They prepared accordingly, reinforcing bunkers, laying minefields, positioning reserve. On the Soviet side, the preparations were methodical, almost liturgical. Officers pored over maps, calculating firing tables, adjusting for weather, for wind, for the curvature of the earth itself. Every gun had a mission, every shell had a target, nothing was random, nothing was wasted. The Soviets had learned from their mistakes. In the early war, they had fired blindly, expending mountains of ammunition for minimal effect. Now they had mastered the science of destruction. Forward observers infiltrated German lines, marking targets with precision. Aerial reconnaissance photographed every bunker, every trench, every command post. Radio intercepts located German headquarters. The Soviets knew where their enemy slept, where they ate, where they kept their ammunition, and they planned to obliterate all of it simultaneously. Among the German defenders was Oberst Heinrich Steiner, a decorated officer who had fought from France to the gates of Moscow. At 43, he was gaunt, exhausted, his face carved into permanent lines of fatigue. He commanded a regiment holding a section of the line near Kielce, a position the high command considered strong. His men were a mixture of hardened veterans and recent conscripts, boys who barely knew how to load a rifle.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Steiner looked at them and saw ghosts. He had seen too many boys become corpses. He had written too many letters to mothers who would never stop weeping.
On the night of January 11th, Steiner stood in his dugout studying maps by candlelight. His adjutant, a young lieutenant named Werner, brought him reports from the forward positions. Increased Soviet activity, movement in the tree line, sounds of engines. Steiner nodded, unsurprised. "They are coming," he said quietly. "Tomorrow perhaps, the day after. Make sure the men have hot food tonight. They will need their strength." Werner hesitated, then asked the question that had been haunting the entire front. "Sir, do you think we can hold them?" Steiner did not answer immediately. He looked at the map, at the thin line of German positions facing the Soviet bridgeheads, and felt a weight in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold. "We will do our duty," he said finally. "That is all any of us can do." He did not tell Werner what he truly thought. He did not say that he had seen the reports from other sectors, the whispers of Soviet buildups so massive they seemed fantastical. He did not say that he had heard rumors of new Soviet tactics, of bombardments that lasted not minutes but hours, that turned entire landscapes into moonscapes. He kept his fear to himself, because that was what officers did. They carried the weight, so their men did not have to. But that night, Heinrich Steiner did not sleep. He sat in his dugout, listening to the wind howl across the frozen fields, and wondered if he would live to see another sunset. Across the lines, in a concealed command post dug into the reverse slope of a hill, Soviet Major General Alexei Volkov oversaw the final preparations. He was a man of 50, his hair iron gray, his eyes cold as the Polish winter. He had survived the purges, survived the early disasters of the war, survived by being competent, ruthless, and utterly loyal to the mission. His artillery brigade was one of dozens concentrated in this sector, and he took pride in the precision of his preparations. Every gun had been registered, test fired to confirm accuracy. Every crew had rehearsed their firing sequences until they could execute them in the dark, in the chaos, in the hell that was about to be unleashed. Volkov did not hate the Germans. He did not think about them as people at all. To him they were targets, map coordinates, problems to be solved with high explosives and shrapnel. He had seen what the Wehrmacht had done to his country, the burned villages, the mass graves, the starvation. He had lost a brother at Stalingrad, a sister in the Leningrad siege, but he did not fight for revenge. He fought because it was his function, his purpose, the thing he had been shaped into by years of war, and he was very, very good at it. On the evening of January 11th, Volkov received the final orders. The offensive would begin at dawn. His brigade would fire for precisely 12 minutes in the initial bombardment, then shift to targets deeper in the German rear. 12 minutes. He allowed himself a thin smile. 12 minutes would be enough. He had calculated the tonnage of explosives his guns would deliver onto a square kilometer of German positions. The numbers were staggering, almost absurd. Nothing could survive it. Nothing human, anyway. He thought briefly of the men on the receiving end, then dismissed the thought. They had chosen their side, now they would pay for it. The guns were ready. Over 10,000 tubes in this sector alone, arranged in layers, in echelons, so that some would fire directly at German positions, while others lobbed shells in high arcs to fall on rear areas. Katyusha rocket launchers, the weapons the Germans called Stalin's organs for the shrieking sound they made, were positioned to saturate entire grid squares with incendiary and fragmentation warheads. Heavy howitzers, 152 mm and 203 mm, were tasked with destroying bunkers and fortifications. Mortars, thousands of them, would rain shells into trenches, into assembly areas, into anywhere German soldiers might hide. And behind it all, trainloads of ammunition, enough to sustain this rate of fire not for minutes, but for days if necessary. The Soviet soldiers who would follow the barrage were equally ready, though few of them understood the scale of what was about to happen. Rifle divisions, tank corps, assault engineers, all massed in the bridgeheads, waiting for the signal to advance. They had been told that the artillery would clear the way, that resistance would be minimal, that this would be the beginning of the end. Some believed it. Others, veterans who had learned to trust nothing, simply checked their weapons and waited. They had learned that war was chaos, that plans dissolved in the first moments of contact, that survival was a matter of luck as much as skill. But even the most cynical among them sensed that something different was coming. The sheer density of guns, the meticulous planning, the grim determination of their officers, all of it pointed to something unprecedented. As midnight passed, and January 12th began, the temperature dropped below freezing. Frost glittered on the barrels of silent guns. German sentries stamped their feet, blew on their hands, peered into the darkness, and saw nothing. In their bunkers, men tried to sleep, huddled under thin blankets, dreaming of home, of warmth, of anything but the cold and the fear. Kenrick Steiner sat in his command post, writing a letter he knew he would never send. To his wife, he wrote of love, of regret, of the hope that their children would grow up in a better world. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his breast pocket, over his heart. Then he stood, put on his coat, and went outside to wait for the dawn. At 4:35, 15 minutes before sunrise, the world ended. There was no warning, no preliminary shots, no ranging fire. One moment, the front was silent. The next, every gun within 100 kilometers fired simultaneously. The sound was not a sound. It was a physical force, a pressure wave, that knocked men off their feet, that shattered eardrums, that turned air into something solid and crushing. The earth convulsed, The sky turned orange, then red, then black with smoke and dust. Shells fell like rain, like hail, like a tsunami of steel and fire crashing down on German positions, with such density that individual explosions merged in. Heinrich Steiner, standing outside his dugout, was thrown to the ground by the first salvo. He tried to stand, but the earth was shaking too violently. Explosions erupted all around him, geysers of dirt and flame, reaching skyward. Trees disintegrated. Bunkers collapsed. Men screamed, but their voices were inaudible beneath the thunder. Steiner crawled back into his dugout, shouting orders that no one could hear. His telephone lines were dead, cut by the first shells. His radio operator was trying to raise headquarters, but there was only static, the hiss of a world drowned in noise. The bombardment did not stop. It did not pause. It intensified. For 12 minutes, the earth itself seemed to be dying. Shells of every caliber fell without pause, without mercy. High explosives cratered the ground, burying men alive in their shelters. Fragmentation rounds scythed through anyone caught in the open, turning flesh into mist. Incendiaries set the frozen landscape ablaze, creating firestorms that sucked the oxygen from the air and left men gasping, suffocating.
And through it all, the Katyusha rockets screamed overhead, trailing smoke, detonating in clusters that left nothing behind but scorched earth and the smell of burning chemicals. German soldiers died in every conceivable way. Some were vaporized by direct hits, their bodies simply ceasing to exist. Others were buried alive when their bunkers collapsed, suffocating in darkness as the earth pressed down. Some were shredded by shrapnel, their bodies opened in ways that made identification impossible. Others died from concussion alone, their organs liquefied by the pressure of nearby explosions, even though their skin remained unbroken. And some, the unlucky ones, survived the initial salvos only to lie wounded, bleeding, screaming for help that would never come as the bombardment continued to churn the earth around them. In his command post, Steiner pressed his hands over his ears and prayed. He was not a religious man, but in that moment, prayer was all he had left. He thought of his wife, of his children, of Sunday mornings in a small church in Bavaria, where the world was quiet and kind. He thought of all the men under his command, boys who had trusted him to keep them alive, and he wept because he knew he had failed them. The dugout shook with each impact, dirt raining from the ceiling, the candles long since extinguished. In the darkness, he heard Werner sobbing, a sound of absolute despair. Steiner reached out, found the young man's shoulder and held on. There was nothing else to do. At exactly 4:47, 12 minutes after it began, the bombardment shifted. The shells that had been falling directly on German front lines suddenly stopped, replaced by fire falling deeper into the rear areas. Command posts, artillery positions, supply dumps, roads, anything that might support the defense was now being systematically destroyed. The sudden change was almost worse than the initial onslaught. For a moment the men in the forward trenches thought it was over, that they had survived. Then they realized the truth. The barrage had not stopped, it had simply moved, and that meant the infantry was coming. Through the smoke and dust, shapes began. All Soviet infantry, thousands of them, advancing in waves behind a rolling barrage that crept forward at a walking pace. Tanks followed, T-34s and heavy IS-2s, their guns adding to the cacophony. The German front line, what remained of it, tried to respond. Machine guns opened fire, spitting tracers into the gray dawn. Anti-tank guns engaged the approaching armor. But it was hopeless. There were too many targets, too much smoke, too much chaos, and every few minutes, Soviet artillery would correct its fire, dropping shells on any position that showed signs of resistance. Heinrich Steiner emerged from his dugout into a landscape that no longer resembled Earth. The forest that had stood behind his position was gone, reduced to splintered stumps and scorched craters. The trench network, carefully constructed over weeks, had been obliterated, filled with dirt, collapsed, erased. Bodies or parts of bodies lay everywhere, some still smoldering. The smell was overpowering, a mixture of explosives, burning wood, and roasted meat. Steiner vomited, then wiped his mouth and tried to assess the situation. His regiment, 1,000 men strong the day before, was gone. He could see perhaps 30 survivors, scattered, dazed, moving like sleepwalkers through the ruins. Werner appeared at his side, blood streaming from his ears, his face blackened with soot. He was shouting something, but Steiner could barely hear him. The ringing in his ears was so loud, it drowned out everything else. He read Werner's lips, "Soviets advancing. What are your orders?" Steiner looked at the young lieutenant, at the terror in his eyes, and felt a profound weariness settle over him. "Orders,
What orders could he give? Retreat, he said, though the word felt meaningless. Fall back to the secondary line. Gather anyone you find. We regroup at Kielce, if we can. They moved through the devastation, collecting survivors, finding more dead than living. Some men were too shell-shocked to move, sitting in craters, staring at nothing. Steiner had to physically pull them to their feet, shout in their faces to break through the fog of trauma. Others were wounded, bleeding from ears and noses, coughing blood from ruptured lungs. They helped who they could, left behind those they could not. It was triage, brutal and necessary. Behind them, the sound of gunfire grew louder, as Soviet infantry reached the front lines, and began mopping up what little resistance remained. By mid-morning, Steiner and his ragged group of survivors reached what was supposed to be the secondary defensive line. It did not exist. Soviet artillery had pounded it to rubble hours ago, part of the same methodical destruction that had erased the front. German corpses lay in heaps, many of them rear echelon troops, who had died without ever seeing the enemy. Steiner felt something inside him break, some last thread of hope or duty, or whatever had been keeping him upright. We cannot stop this, he said aloud, to no one in particular. This is not war, this is extinction. Werner, still beside him, looked at his commander with something like pity. Sir, we have to keep moving. If we stay here, we die. Steiner nodded slowly, mechanically. Yes, we keep moving. That is all we do now. Move, and die a little later, rather than now. He turned to the remnants of his regiment, fewer than 50 men out of 1,000, and gave the only order that mattered. West. We go west. Stay together, stay quiet, and we might survive the day. Maybe. They marched west, through a landscape transformed into hell. Every village they passed was burning, or already reduced to ash. Roads were cratered, bridges blown, forests stripped bare by shellfire, and everywhere, the sound of Soviet artillery, a distant rumble that never stopped, a heartbeat of destruction that pulsed across the entire front. Other German units streamed past them, equally shattered, equally lost. Officers shouted orders no one followed. Soldiers abandoned weapons, abandoned wounded comrades, abandoned everything in a desperate flight from the storm behind them. Heinrich Steiner, Oberst of the Wehrmacht, veteran of a dozen campaigns, walked among the defeated, and understood that everything he had believed about war had been a lie. Tactics meant nothing, when the enemy could simply erase your positions before you could react. Training meant nothing, when the men you trained died before they could use it. Courage meant nothing, when the weapon you faced was not soldiers but physics, the sheer tonnage of explosives, falling from the sky in quantities that defied comprehension. The Soviets had not outfought them, they had outdestroyed them, reduced warfare to its most elemental truth. Whoever could deliver more violence faster would win, and everything else was illusion. That night, what remained of Steiner's regiment bivouacked in a barn 20 kilometers behind where the front line had been that morning. They had no food, no medical supplies, no contact with higher command. They simply collapsed, too exhausted to care whether Soviet scouts would find them, too broken to worry about tomorrow. Steiner sat alone in the corner, his back against a wall, and stared at nothing. Werner approached him, hesitated, then sat down nearby. Sir, the lieutenant said quietly, what happened today? Is this what it will be like now? For the rest of the war? Steiner did not answer immediately. He thought about the bombardment, about the sound that had ended the world, about the mathematics of it. 32,000 guns across the front, millions of shells, 12 minutes of fire so intense it had destroyed an entire defensive system, and the Soviets could do it again, tomorrow. The day after, every day all the way to Berlin. He looked at Werner, at the young man's haunted eyes and spoke the truth. Yes, he said softly, this is what it will be. This is how we lose. Not in battle, but in bombardment. Not defeated, but erased. The Soviets have learned to kill faster than we can die, and there is no counter to it. No defense. No hope. Werner absorbed this, then asked one more question, the one that truly mattered. Then why do we keep fighting? Steiner closed his eyes, exhausted beyond measure, and answered with the only truth he had left. Because we are soldiers, Werner. Because we have orders. Because to stop fighting is to admit that all the dying has been for nothing. So we keep fighting, not because we can win, but because we do not know how to do anything else. And because when the shells fall they do not care whether we believe in the cause or not. They kill us regardless. Outside, the distant rumble of artillery continued through the night, a lullaby of annihilation, a promise that tomorrow would bring more of the same. The Red Storm had only just begun, and for the Wehrmacht there would be no shelter from it, no respite, no mercy, only the long grinding march toward a defeat that was no longer in doubt, only delayed. The Soviets had transformed artillery from a weapon into a force of nature, and nature cannot be reasoned with, cannot be outmaneuvered, cannot be stopped. It can only be endured until it consumes everything in its path, and then silence. The second wave arrived at noon, and with it came the realization that the morning had been merely the overture. Rich Steiner and his survivors had managed to reach the outskirts of Kielce, a town that had served as a rear area command center, just hours before. Now it was chaos incarnate. Refugees streamed through the streets, their faces blank with shock. Wounded soldiers lay in doorways, unattended, some calling for medics who would never come. The administrative buildings that had housed staff officers were burning, struck by long-range Soviet guns that were systematically destroying anything resembling infrastructure. Steiner found a functioning radio in the basement of what had once been a schoolhouse. The operator, a corporal with trembling hands, was trying to establish contact with Army Group headquarters. Static filled the room, punctuated by fragmentary transmissions, voices speaking in clipped, desperate tones, entire divisions reporting catastrophic losses, commanders requesting permission to withdraw, and beneath it all the constant background noise of artillery, picked up by microphones across the front, a mechanical thunder that never ceased. Werner stood beside him, listening to the reports with growing horror. "Sir," he whispered, "they are saying the entire 1st Panzer Army has been encircled. The 4th Army has ceased to exist as a coherent force. How is this possible, in one day?" Steiner did not answer. He was listening to a transmission from a general whose name he recognized, a man known for his iron composure. The general's voice was ragged, breaking. "We have no defensive line. We have no reserves. Every position we establish is destroyed within the hour. The Soviets are not advancing. They are steamrolling. We cannot stop them. We can only run." The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by static. The corporal tried to re-establish contact, but found only silence. Steiner felt a coldness settle in his chest. He had known, abstractly, that the situation was catastrophic. But hearing it confirmed, hearing the collapse described in real time by men who had never known defeat, brought a clarity that was almost peaceful. The war was over, not officially, not yet, but in every way that mattered. The question now was not victory but survival, and even that seemed increasingly unlikely. Outside, the sound of engines drew his attention. Soviet armor was approaching the town from the east. T-34, their broad turrets swiveling, searching for targets. Swiss force, their broad turrets swiveling, searching for targets. Infantry followed in their wake, moving with the confidence of men who knew resistance would be minimal. Steiner gathered his survivors, perhaps 40 men now, and led them out the back of the building. There would be no stand here, no heroic defense. They moved through alleys, through gardens, slipping between houses as Soviet forces entered Kielce from the main road. Behind them, gunfire erupted, sporadic and brief. The few German troops who had tried to defend the town were being eliminated methodically, room by room. They reached the western edge of town just as Soviet artillery found the range. Shells began falling on the buildings they had just vacated, turning brick and mortar into shrapnel. Steiner did not look back. He led his men across open fields, toward a tree line that might offer concealment. They moved as shadows, staying low, avoiding roads. Other German soldiers joined them, stragglers from shattered units, men without officers, without orders, united only by the instinct to flee westward, away from the red tide that was swallowing everything behind them. By evening they had covered another 15 kilometers. Steiner's group had swollen to nearly 200 men, a makeshift battalion of survivors. They took shelter in an abandoned manor house, its owners long since fled. There was no food, but they found a well with clean water and drank greedily. Men collapsed on the floors, too exhausted to speak. Steiner moved among them, checking for wounded, offering what comfort he could. He found a young soldier, barely 17, crying silently in a corner. The boy looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes, and asked a question that had no answer. "Why did they do that to us? What did we do to deserve that?" Steiner knelt beside him, put a hand on his shoulder. "We are at war," he said quietly, "and the Soviets have learned to wage it better than we have. That is all. No divine judgment, no moral failing, Just a hard truth, they have more guns, more shells, more will to use them without restraint. We built our army for elegance, they built theirs for annihilation. The boy nodded, not understanding, not really, but taking some small comfort in the presence of an officer who spoke to him like a human being, rather than a cog in a machine. That night, Steiner sat alone on the manor's steps, staring at the eastern horizon. It glowed orange, not from sunset, but from fires, hundreds of them, stretching as far as he could see. Entire forests were burning, set ablaze by incendiary shells, towns were collapsing into ash, and above it all the aurora of explosions, flashes of light that strobed against the low clouds in a rhythm that never stopped. He thought about the mathematics of it, the sheer industrial capacity required to sustain this level of violence. The Soviets were not just fighting a war, they were demonstrating the superiority of their system, proving that a command economy mobilized for total war could outproduce, outsupply, and outkill anything the Reich could muster. Werner joined him, offering a canteen. Steiner drank, tasted only metal and exhaustion. The lieutenant sat beside him, following his gaze to the burning horizon. "Do you think anyone will remember this?" Werner asked. "What happened today? Will it matter to history, or will it just be another day in a long list of days?" Steiner considered the question. "History will remember the outcome," he said. "That the Soviets broke through, that Germany fell, but the details, the how of it, the moment when we realized we were not fighting an army but a machine designed to erase us, that will be footnotes. Known only to those who lived it, and those few who care to look." He paused, then continued, speaking more to himself than to Werner. 50 times deadlier, the report said. 50 times more lethal than what we expected. But even that number does not capture it. What we faced today was not a multiplication of what came before. It was a transformation. Artillery ceased to be a tool, and became the entire interface. Everything else, the tanks, the infantry, the aircraft, they are just there to occupy what the guns have already killed. We have no answer to this. No doctrine, no tactic, no weapon that can counter it. And so we die, or we run, and the difference between the two is only a matter of time. Werner absorbed this in silence, then asked one final question. "What will you do, sir? When we reach somewhere safe, if we reach somewhere safe, will you keep fighting?" Steiner did not answer immediately. He thought about duty, about the oath he had sworn, about the thousands of men who had died under his command, trusting him to lead them well. He thought about his wife, his children, the life he had left behind, and he thought about the impossibility of it all, the futility of continuing a war that was already lost. "I will do what I have always done," he said finally. "I will follow orders until there are no more orders to follow. I will protect the men under my command, until there are no more men to protect, and when the end comes, I will face it as a soldier, because that is the only identity I have left." But do I believe in victory? No. Do I believe in the cause? No. I fight now, only because the alternative is to surrender to despair, and I am not ready for that. Not yet. The days that followed blurred into a nightmare of constant retreat. Steiner's group moved west, always west, merging with other survivors, splitting when Soviet forces threatened to encircle them. The artillery followed them like a living thing, seeking them out, hurting them, denying them rest. Every time they tried to establish a defensive position, Soviet observers would spot them, and within minutes, shells would begin falling. Not the apocalyptic salvos of the first day, but enough to scatter them, to kill a few, to remind them that they were prey, being hunted by a predator that never tired. They passed through towns that had been obliterated, their populations fled or dead. They saw German columns that had been caught in the open by air strikes, vehicles burned to husks, bodies scattered like discarded toys. They encountered rear echelon troops, who had never seen combat, staff officers in clean uniforms, who demanded to know why the front had collapsed. Steiner ignored them, pushed past them, focused only on keeping his men moving. Explanations were for survivors. He was not yet sure he would qualify. On the 5th day after the initial bombardment, they reached what remained of Army Group headquarters, now relocated to a fortress town, 60 kilometers from where it had started. Steiner reported to a colonel he did not recognize, a man with dead eyes, and a voice like gravel. The colonel listened to his account, nodded mechanically, and assigned him to a scratch defensive line being assembled to slow the Soviet advance. Orders were sparse: hold as long as possible, then withdraw in good order. No mention of counterattacks, of reinforcements, of anything resembling hope. Just delay, retreat, repeat until there was nowhere left to retreat to. Steiner gathered his survivors, now numbering less than 100, and led them to their assigned sector. It was a low ridge, overlooking a river crossing, a position that in theory could be defended. In practice, it was a killing ground waiting to happen. The men dug in as best they could, scraping shallow trenches in the frozen earth, stacking sandbags scavenged from abandoned positions. They worked in silence, each man understanding that this was likely where they would die, but going through the motions anyway because the alternative was to simply sit and wait for the end. The Soviets arrived at dawn, the next day, not with an assault, but with the now familiar prelude, artillery. The bombardment was shorter this time, only 5 minutes, but concentrated on their ridge with precision that suggested forward observers had marked their positions during the night. Shells walked across the trenches, detonating in sequence, a metronome of death. Steiner pressed himself into the earth, felt the concussions hammer his body, heard men screaming as shrapnel found them. When the barrage lifted, Soviet infantry was already crossing the river, supported by tanks whose guns added their own fire to the chaos. The defense lasted less than an hour. Steiner's men fought well, considering their exhaustion, their lack of ammunition, their certainty of defeat. Machine guns chattered, cutting down the first wave of attackers. Anti-tank rifles cracked, disabling one T-34 that slewed sideways, blocking the bridge. But there were always more Soviets, more tanks, more guns. And when German fire slackened, Soviet artillery resumed, targeting any position that had revealed itself. One by one, Steiner's strongpoints fell silent, buried under rubble, or simply abandoned as their defenders fled. Steiner gave the order to withdraw when he realized they were about to be outflanked. His survivors, perhaps 60 now, scrambled out of their trenches and ran for the secondary position, a kilometer behind the ridge. They made it halfway before Soviet mortars found them, dropping shells among the fleeing men. Steiner saw Werner go down, clutching his leg, blood pouring between his fingers. He turned back, grabbed the young lieutenant under the arms, and dragged him toward cover. Others helped, forming a tight knot of men around their wounded, firing blindly at pursuing Soviet infantry, while moving as fast as they could. They reached the secondary position, a cluster of ruined farm buildings, and collapsed behind its walls. A medic, one of the few still alive, worked on Werner's leg, cutting away shredded cloth, applying a tourniquet. The wound was bad, bone visible, blood loss significant. Werner looked up at Steiner, his face gray, and tried to speak. Steiner shushed him, held his hand. "You will be fine," he lied. "We will get you to an aid station, just hold on." Werner nodded weakly, then passed out from shock. The medic looked at Steiner and shook his head slightly. "Hours maybe. Not more." Steiner nodded, understanding. He had seen enough dying to recognize it. The Soviets did not press their attack immediately. Instead they brought up more artillery, positioning guns in the open, not even bothering with camouflage. Steiner watched through binoculars as Soviet crews worked with mechanical efficiency, sighting their tubes, stacking shells, preparing to obliterate the farm buildings, just as they had obliterated everything else. He turned to his remaining men, 38 by his count, and spoke clearly. "We cannot hold here. We leave now, before the barrage. Grab wounded if you can carry them. Leave everything else. Move north through the woods. We regroup wherever we find other forces. This is not surrender. This is survival. Now go." They fled into the forest just as the first shells struck the farm buildings, reducing stone walls to powder. Steiner carried Werner on his back, the young lieutenant's blood soaking into his uniform. Others carried wounded comrades, or helped those too shell-shocked to move on their own. They moved like ghosts through the trees, hearing Soviet voices behind them, the clank of treads, the rustle of infantry moving through underbrush. For hours they walked, not knowing if they were moving toward safety or simply deeper into the Soviet rear. Exhaustion made every step agony, but stopping meant capture or death, so they kept. At some point in the afternoon, Steiner felt the moment, the sudden limpness, the cessation of breathing. He lowered the body gently to the ground, closed the young man's eyes, and stood looking down at him. 23 years old, a lifetime ahead of him, stolen by high explosives and mathematics. Steiner wanted to say something, some words of eulogy, but his throat was too tight. He simply turned away, leaving Werner's body in the forest, and kept walking. There would be time to mourn later, if later ever came. By evening, Steiner's group had dwindled to 26 men. They found a German outpost, a platoon of militaries who had been tasked with rounding up stragglers. The MP sergeant looked at them with contempt, demanded to know why they were retreating without orders. Steiner, too tired to argue, simply stared at the man until he looked away. "We have been fighting since January 12, Steiner said flatly. "We have held every position we were ordered to hold until it became untenable. We have lost 3/4 of our strength. If you have a problem with that, I suggest you experience Soviet artillery for yourself. Then we can discuss cowardice." The sergeant backed down, pointed toward a collection point where survivors were being reorganized. Steiner led his men there, found hundreds of other soldiers in similar condition, hollow-eyed, filthy, traumatized. A major was attempting to form them into coherent units, assigning officers, distributing what little ammunition was available. Steiner reported, gave his account, and was told to rest. His men would be absorbed into a new defensive line being established further west, always one step ahead of the red tide. That night, Steiner sat alone, thinking about the past week, the bombardment, the retreat, the constant dying. All of it felt unreal, like a nightmare he could not wake from. He thought about the doctrine he had been taught, the elegant theories of combined arms and maneuver warfare. All of it had dissolved in the face of Soviet artillery, rendered meaningless by sheer tonnage of explosives. The Germans had built an army designed to outthink the enemy. The Soviets had built one designed to outkill them, and killing, it turned out, was more decisive than thinking. He wondered if anyone in high command understood this yet, or if they were still clinging to illusions of counter-offensives and miracle weapons. He wondered if it mattered. The outcome was already written. The Soviets would grind west, destroying everything in their path, until they reached Berlin, and then the war would end, not with negotiations or conditional surrender, but with absolute defeat. Germany would cease to exist as a military power, its army annihilated, its cities rubble, its people left to pick through the ruins, and wonder how it had come to this. The answer, Steiner knew, was simple. They had believed their own mythology, believed that superior tactics and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage. They had underestimated their enemy, dismissed Soviet numerical superiority as quantity without quality. They had been wrong, catastrophically wrong, and millions had died for that error. The Soviets had learned from their defeats, adapted, transformed their military into something monstrous but effective. Germany had not adapted. It had doubled down on doctrines that no longer worked, sent men to die in battles that could not be won, and now faced the consequences. Heinrich Steiner, Oberst of the Wehrmacht, sat in the darkness and accepted the truth. He would not see the end of the war. He would die somewhere between here and Berlin, killed by artillery, or a sniper, or simple exhaustion. His name would be forgotten, his service unmarked, his death one among millions. But in the days or weeks he had left, he would do his duty. Not for the Reich, not for the Führer, not for ideology, but for the men beside him, the survivors who still looked to him for leadership, for hope, for some meaning in the madness. That, at least, he could give them. That, and a quick death when the shells finally found him. The war continued. The Soviets advanced. German forces retreated, fought, died, retreated again, and always, the artillery followed, the distant thunder that never ceased, the mechanical heartbeat of annihilation. By April 1945, when Soviet guns began shelling Berlin itself, the lesson was complete. The age of tactical elegance had ended. The age of overwhelming firepower had begun, and the men who had learned that lesson the hard way, who had survived the bombardments, the retreats, the endless dying, carried the knowledge with them into whatever future awaited. That war was no longer an art, it was mathematics, and the side with more guns, more shells, more willingness to turn entire landscapes into graveyards would win, always. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.